Now that we finished this app here, and now that we finished this course section here in general, and we learned about many crucial Flutter and Dart features, I want to end this section by diving into 3 Dart features you should know, which are totally optional though, which you don't have to use in this or other projects, but which you might want to use or which you might see in other projects you're working on. And also features we will use from time to time throughout the rest of this course, which is why you should know about them. And I want to start here in the quiz Dart file. There we have this quiz state class, which is this state class for the quiz widget. And you learned that stateful widgets are basically split across these 2 classes. Now the quiz state class here is actually called underscore quiz state. And I mentioned earlier in this section that this leading underscore is a Dart specific thing in the end. By adding an underscore in front of a class name, you tell Dart that this class is meant to be private and should basically only be usable inside of this file. But if another file would import QuizDart, it would not be able to access this quiz state class. And the reason for that is that this quiz state class really belongs to this quiz class and should therefore not be used outside of this file in any other context. The quiz class then also does not have that leading underscore because it indeed is not private but publicly available. Now that is not a new concept, of course, I mentioned it before, but it is a concept you should keep in mind. But what you should know is that you cannot just turn classes into private classes by adding such an underscore, but also properties and methods inside of classes. We could, for example, convert selected answers to a private property by adding a leading underscore. Of course, we have to do that in all the places where selected answers is used thereafter. Otherwise, we have an error that some identifier can't be found. But with that, you would make it clear that selected answers is really meant to be only used inside of this file here, and if another file could get access to the quiz state class, because it maybe would not be private, then that other code in another file should still not be able to access selected answers, because even though the class is now public, this is still marked as a private property that should only be usable inside of this file here essentially. Now here I'll switch this back to a private class, and this is not something you have to do here, it's not important for this app we're building here, but you will sometimes see property names that start with leading underscores, and it is important to understand that this in the end means that these are private properties or private methods. You can add such an underscore there as well, and this simply means that those properties and methods are meant to be only used inside of the file where the class is defined. And if the class is the only thing defined in a file, then those properties and methods would essentially be private to that class and would not be usable anywhere else in your code in any other file. So that's what this syntax is all about. Another Dart feature, which is optional but which you should know about, are getters. And I can show you a great example for a getter here in the results screen widget class. There we have this getSummaryData method, which in the end simply produces a list which it then returns. And this list which it produces is based on this chosen answers property in the end, that and this questions list which we defined in another file. Now defining this as a method like this is absolutely fine, but if you have methods like this, which take no input values, no parameters, and which in the end then just produce some data based on some other class properties, you could also use a getter instead by using an alternative Dart syntax. For that syntax, you would rename that method to sound more like a property, so that it would describe data that's inside of it. For example, summary data instead of get summary data. You would then remove those parentheses and instead add the get keyword in front of it. This is a special keyword in Dart which creates a getter. And a getter in the end is still a method. You still have your function body here. This code still executes, but you don't call summary data like a method. So you don't call summary data like this with parentheses thereafter, but instead you simply refer to it as a variable. So now here we would have some name duplication, and creating this extra final variable here would now simply be redundant. Instead, I can get rid of that line here, and I can now still access summary data like a property or like a variable that does not change, even though under the hood it's a method. But because of this get keyword, this in the end can be used like a property by accessing it like this, but internally it behaves like a method. So that's another Dart feature which you can use as an alternative to defining a method, and it's great for use cases like this where you have a method that in the end just transforms data that's stored in another property of the class. Another example for a method that could be converted to a getter can be found in the quiz question Dart file. There we have this getShuffledAnswers method, which in the end also is just such a getter. It takes another class property, answers, and then derives some data based on that property. So here we could also rename this to ShuffledAnswers to describe what's inside of it, remove the parentheses and add get in front of it, and now this could be used like a property, whilst internally, by Dart, it would still be executed as a method. Of course, here I now have to go to the place where I called getShuffledAnswers and change this from a method call to a method that doesn't exist anymore to a property access like this without parentheses. So that's the idea behind getters. Again, using them is optional. You can stick to methods, but this is a bit shorter and a feature you will also see being used in many projects. You will also see it from time to time in this course, and you should therefore know about getters. Now, the last optional Dart feature I want to dive in are so-called arrow functions. And for that, I'm back here in the results screen widget, because there I have a great example for a place where an arrow function could be used. Now, what is an arrow function? Well, in your Dart and Flutter projects, you'll often have functions like this. This anonymous function here, which takes some input and then in its function body immediately returns a value. Especially when using those list methods like where or map, it's quite common that you don't have a lot of complex code in that function body, but that you instead only have a single return statement in there where you then return some derived value. Now, if you have such a case, so a simple anonymous function which might take some input values and which then immediately returns and performs no other operations inside of the function body, if you have a case like this, you can change this code to add an arrow consisting of an equal sign and a greater sign so that it looks like an arrow. And then you can remove those curly braces, opening and closing, and the return keyword. And you can not just do that, you have to do that. And instead write it like this. You also need to remove that semicolon at the end. This then is a so-called arrow function, and it's simply more concise than writing a function with the curly braces and the extra return keyword. So this feature exists to allow you to write more concise code. Using it is optional. There's nothing wrong with using that other function approach, but this simply is a bit shorter, and that's why you might want to use this approach for functions that only have a return statement in their function body.